My name is Andy Morse, and I'm the Executive Director of the Society of the Cincinnati and our educational division, the American Revolution Institute.
I'm Emily Parsons, Deputy Director and Curator for the Society of the Cincinnati at Anderson House.
Washington, D.C. has changed considerably from the days when Anderson House was constructed. This building was built during 1902 to 1905 timeframe. The very first events, in fact, happened here at the very end of March of 1905. At that time, Washington was a shadow of a city that it is today. In fact, this section of the city was relatively remote. Embassy Row was a number of blocks over to the east of here, and this was an area that still had, in many cases, woodlands and open pastures in its own right. So they were, in some sense, Andersons were urban pioneers when they opened Anderson House.
So to design and build this house, the Andersons chose a Boston firm, Little and Brown. They were mostly at that point known for colonial revival buildings in New England. But the Andersons wanted a different style for this home. They wanted something more European. And Herbert Brown probably took the lead in designing this house. He had just returned from a trip to Europe and studies there, so he would have been more familiar with the architecture in England, in Italy, in France, and some of the countries they drew inspiration from. The style of the house has been described in a variety of ways. Most broadly speaking, it's a neoclassical home during a period in the Gilded Age when Beaux architecture was most popular, especially for wealthy homes like this. Although this house is not technically, academically speaking, really a proper Beaux home. It has just too eclectic of a mix of inspirations. It's been called a variety of things, inspired by Palladian architecture, inspired by Renaissance Revival, Neo-Georgian, a variety of things. So neoclassical is sort of a good umbrella term for how eclectic both the exterior and the interiors are here. When this house was being built in the DuPont Circle neighborhood of Washington, this was the most fashionable place, the most popular place for wealthy couples or families to be building their homes. Mostly because this was on the fringes of developed Washington at the time, so there was available land.
In 1905, much of Massachusetts Avenue wasn't even paved yet. For that matter, the National Cathedral, again, another iconic landmark just west of here, they hadn't even started construction on the National Cathedral yet. So many of the items for construction, the materials, pillars, columns, boards, wood, any of the manufacturing pieces necessary to build this grand edifice literally had to be brought by horse-drawn carriage from docks down at the Potomac River just south of here and pulled uphill to Massachusetts Avenue to be stored and then used in the process of our construction.
But then you have the bones of the house being constructed by structural steel, structural brick, and then faced with limestone, looking very classical and old world on the outside, but with bones of the house that were much more modern, even thought to be almost fireproof. They also used things like terracotta brick in the construction of the house, as well as various parts of the interiors. But then the interiors themselves also finished with lots of very classical materials and older techniques of hand carving stone and wood elements, marble mostly imported from Italy, but also Ireland, and a little bit of domestic materials there. The workmen did a lot of this work on site, carving stone and wood and putting those elements in place. When Anderson House was finished in 1905, the newspapers in Washington and elsewhere reported extensively on the completion of this extraordinary mansion and giving their readers a glimpse of what this house was like and raved especially about its staircases. The flying staircase in the ballroom in particular has always been a notable aspect of the architecture of the house and this engineering feat as well. There's no supports from the staircase underneath. The stairs themselves are steel beams anchored into the wall that are then coated, sort of skinned, in pieces of marble, and then with a really lovely wrought iron balustrade and railing.
Larz and Isabel Anderson were one of the most prominent and one of the most interesting couples of the early 20th century. Larz Anderson originated from a family that started in Virginia prior to the Revolutionary War. and ultimately ended up in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he spent some of his childhood. Isabel Anderson was born Isabel Welch Perkins. The families, the Welds and the Perkinses, were very prominent Massachusetts and Boston families for many decades, all of which very successful. When she was just a teenager, as her father passed away, she became one of the wealthiest bachelorettes in the United States of America. Larz Anderson went to Harvard University, and after that went into the United States Diplomatic Service and had posts in Washington, Great Britain, and also Rome, Italy. And in fact, it's in Rome, Italy, where the Andersons ended up meeting. Larz Anderson was working as a junior officer in the diplomatic desk of the U.S. Embassy in Rome, and Isabel Anderson was doing her grand tour of Europe. Their meeting became a love at first sight union in many respects, and they were married not long thereafter. Boston was their original home, but Washington, D.C. had an appeal for them as well. This was in part because Larz had family who had moved to Washington not long before they were married. At the same time, Washington, D.C. was already a diplomatic and becoming an international hub in its own right, and that moved perfectly into the world of what Larz had entered as being part of American Foreign Service. So the idea of creating Anderson House provided the new couple with an opportunity to have a second home, almost compared to their massive residence in Boston. This was a winter cottage in many respects, but it was a facility where the Andersons could enjoy entertaining friends, family, and all parts of the political and diplomatic community that was emerging in Washington, D.C.
Among the interests that Isabel Anderson had herself was the American Red Cross. She was very involved, and as World War I approached, she and Larz were both incredibly supportive of American intervention in World War I and wished for it to happen sooner than it did. And beginning in 1914, were really moved by stories of privations and other difficulties that citizens in France and Belgium were having, not having enough food or other supplies for daily life. So they would hold events here to encourage their fellow sort of wealthy society members to donate for the relief of French and Belgian citizens. Isabel felt so strongly about supporting the war effort in World War I that she actually went over to France and Belgium with the Red Cross as a nurse and served both in Red Cross hospitals and canteens, as well as embedded with some French and Belgian units. She had an adventurous spirit and really did not seem fearful of being closer to the front lines and wanted to go where she could be more useful. That same spirit actually translated back in Washington when she returned home from the war, as did so many others, and were met with the Spanish flu epidemic. So she, with her Red Cross training, fresh off of this war effort in Europe, she went into even some of the hardest hit and poorest neighborhoods in Washington, helping families who had sick family members, probably helping them to do things she'd never done for herself before in her life, doing laundry, cooking, cleaning up, and helping to care for these afflicted fellow Washingtonians.
Larz Anderson's family also traces well back to the beginning of the country, and in fact has an enormous tie into the American Revolution. Larz's great-grandfather was a gentleman named Richard Clough Anderson. Richard Anderson was a man who lived in the central part of Virginia, and he was an important officer in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. In fact, at one point, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson was the aide-de-camp to the Marquis de Lafayette during 1781. Richard Clough Anderson, because of his great knowledge of the backwoods of Virginia, was able to help Lafayette make sure that he eluded Lord Cornwallis, as Lord Cornwallis spent almost 4 months during the spring and summer of 1781 chasing Lafayette around the state. He never caught him. They never had a battle of any particular significance, or even much of a skirmish for that matter. But by the same token, they always prevented Cornwallis from ever being able to get to arms depots or do some of the damage around the state that Cornwallis was trying to wreak havoc with. Richard Clough Anderson was an original member of the Society of the Cincinnati. He was a part of the Virginia Society, and he took his society membership with great pride. His great-grandson, Larz Anderson, also took a Cincinnati membership that he enjoyed thanks to his legacy of his great-grandfather. He took that legacy very seriously. And if you look around Anderson House, you'll see a number of examples of where symbols involving, insignia involving the Society of Cincinnati are discreetly etched, painted, and placed in certain spots around the house, all suggesting the care and affection that Larz Anderson felt for the Society of Cincinnati. Mrs. Anderson was also a member of a number of patriotic organizations, most particularly the Daughters of the American Revolution. And much of the work that they did in a way of philanthropy over their lifetime and their union together were all for a variety of patriotic causes. The Society of the Cincinnati was founded in May of 1783 at the very last hours of the American Revolution. It was founded by the officers of the Continental Army and Navy and their French counterparts, and it had two primary missions, one of which was to make sure that the ideals and the reasons for why the American Revolution was fought were never to be forgotten. Those achievements that came from that revolution, the wonderful joys that we benefit from today of liberty, justice, equality, natural and civil rights, they were all fundamental values to the men who founded this organization. The original members of the society, besides Richard Clough Anderson, of course, reads like a hall of worthies. George Washington was our first President General. In modern terms, that would be our board chairman. Although he was not actually active in the founding of it, he was active in the blessing of the creation of the organization and did accept the role to be the first President General, a role that he held literally until the day he died in December of 1799. Other original members of the organization included the Marquis de Lafayette, Henry Knox, General Rochambeau, and the list goes on and on. The second reason that the Society of Cincinnati was founded was to make sure that the men who fought the American Revolution could stay together as a group, and they would be the ones initially charged with making sure that the memory and the reasons for why the American Revolution was fought were never forgotten. They, by extension, though, passed that duty, that responsibility down to their descendants. And so sons, grandsons, and on legacy down through the ages of members of the Society of Cincinnati, including our members today, are all descendants of those original officers of the Continental Army and Navy, and again, as well as their French counterparts. Prior to April 19th, 1775, when the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, almost every person on this earth was a subject. They were beholden to somebody. It might have been a king or a queen, a czar or a czarina, a doge, a lord, a master, but in one form or another, they were subjects. But as of the morning of April 19, 1775, when the American Revolution began, people in our country had the opportunity to no longer be subjects, but to be citizens. And that wonderful opportunity for citizenship has spread all around this globe, so that not only just millions of Americans, but millions and millions of people all around the earth enjoy the privileges of citizenship, all operated properly within the context of republican democracies. Today, that mission becomes an educational mission for this organization. And in fact, while Anderson House is still a place where grand entertaining can occur, just as it did in the days of the Andersons, this is a center for scholarship and education as well.
Larz Anderson was so devoted to the Society of the Cincinnati and its mission that he had its eagle insignia incorporated into the architecture of the house in several places. Even on the exterior, on a pediment on the facade of the home, is the eagle with a banner that reads Anderson. So even those on the street who never had an invitation to come inside would have seen this insignia and known the association between the Anderson family and this organization going back to the beginning of our American Republic. The Andersons used the house here in Washington most often for entertaining, most often for formal dinner parties, which at the time followed a very prescribed sequence of events. Starting with guests arriving, the Andersons greeting their guests in the key room at the top of the Great Staircase, surrounded by murals of Larz Anderson's family history. Then they would invite their guests into the French and English drawing rooms for a brief cocktail, not even hour, just until the last guest arrived. And then they would be invited to the dining room at the other end of the floor. So they'd go through the long gallery to the dining room, which was also a very European style room. They also entertained mostly in a European fashion and served mostly European food in a French style. They employed mostly a Swedish cook. The Swedish cooks were thought to be very clean and efficient at the time. And only on several occasions did they bring in a French chef just for a couple really important days.
Anderson House is a place that's been visited by score and score of prominent Americans and citizens of the world as well. In fact, if the walls could talk in this building, it would certainly have stories to tell. They even lent the house out for a week so that the King of Siam and his entourage could stay here in the early 1930s when the King of Siam had come to the United States to have eye surgery at Johns Hopkins University. At least 19 presidents of the United States have been members of the Society of Cincinnati, either hereditary members or honorary members, and at least 9 of those presidents have actually visited Anderson House. Presidential visits would have begun in the early 1900s because the Andersons were very close friends with a fellow Ohioan, William Howard Taft, who was, of course, President of the United States and then later Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Long before the State Department had its beautiful diplomatic reception rooms downtown in Washington, Anderson House was used as its own equivalent almost of a diplomatic reception rooms because the number of people that came here representing world leaders goes on and on. This house has seen people like Charles de Gaulle, Winston Churchill, Anwar Sadat, Nikita Khrushchev, the King of Siam, and many of those world leaders that visited here were being entertained by presidents of the United States. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for there to be a White House state dinner one night, and the next night, head of state from that country would actually be entertaining the president here, as well as the vice president of the Supreme Court and members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and senior parts of the U.S. military. One of the great moments that occurred in Anderson House was actually the induction into the Society of Cincinnati of none other than Winston Churchill, which occurred in January of 1952. Prime Minister Churchill stood in our ballroom in front of our fireplace to receive the insignia of the Society of Cincinnati along with his induction diploma from the President General and senior members of the Society of that time. U.S. President Harry Truman loved Anderson House. He visited here at least 8 different times. And in fact, there was a surprise birthday party planned by his Attorney General, Clark Clifford. He was able to convince Truman to come to Anderson House, not realizing that he was actually planning an enormous celebration for Truman's 65th birthday.
The Andersons also did support contemporary artists with various commissions and other purchases they made of artists who they got to know. And more so than any other was Jose Villegas, who's a Spanish artist. The Andersons worked with him several times. The first time they met him, it was to purchase the largest piece of art that they would buy for Anderson House, a large oil painting called The Triumph of the Dogaressa. It's about 25 feet wide. And the Andersons purchased it in 1902 and had to make sure that that part of the house was going to be wide enough, so had to work with the architects to make sure any adjustments could be made. The subject matter is a 15th century Venice. At the time, Venice was an independent state. Its elected leader was the Doge, and in 1424, Doge Francesco Foscari was elected. He was the longest serving Doge in Venetian history, marked by a period of prosperity and peace, and so his story became popular to tell in the 19th century in Europe. And Villegas was one of a number of artists who chose to picture him, and now he graces the Great Staircase at Anderson House. For the Winter Garden on the first floor of Anderson House, the Andersons had commissioned 2 different murals, very different subject matter, but both showing their personalities and, again, things that were important to them. One of them is 2 murals of their favorite driving routes in and around Washington. These were painted by H. Siddons Mowbray, who was one of the foremost muralists of the period. And these murals show driving routes in Washington, right down the center of the mall, around the Capitol, Union Station, the Soldiers' Home, where President Lincoln's cottage is today. You do even see Anderson House, as well as a little caricature of Larz and Isabel driving. They owned 30-some cars over their lifetime. They really embraced modern automobiles, and they loved motoring around the city. You also see 2 boats in the Potomac that represent a steamboat as well as a yacht that the Andersons either bought or rented and used to sail up and down the East Coast, and loved to travel that way as well.
One of the reasons that Anderson House is so important today is that it is an historic national landmark. It's also one of the city's most beautiful and enduring Gilded Age mansions. In fact, it's one of the few buildings built as such that looks very similar to how it would have in the days when the Andersons would have first moved in here. But it's also, as I mentioned, a center of education and something that is also where all of the meetings and much of the official proceedings of the Society of Cincinnati occur to this day. So we have a place that's still an important gathering and entertaining center for the city of Washington. We also have a place that preserves a great deal of the history of this wonderful city, but at the same time is a center for new and growing education so that more and more people can understand and appreciate why the American Revolution was founded and why those founding ideals for the United States of America will always be timeless and immutable. One of the things that we aspire for Anderson House to always be will be a center for education. And again, that's why the American Revolution Institute's work as our educational division is so very important. But the fact that we are a center for scholarship is something that we're extremely proud of. We care about the researchers and scholars that do come to Anderson House, and we want to steward them well, not only while they're here, but for years to come after they're left here to do other and continue, hopefully, to come back and do more research. So simply stated, we'd like the Anderson House and the Society of Cincinnati's American Revolution Institute to sort of become like the Hotel California of the American Revolution. You can check out, but you can never leave.